Ian. Ian MacDonald lives in a small town called Auchinleck in Ayrshire, Scotland. Last year, he drove down to Dumfries, and on the 7-6 road that goes from Cumnock to Dumfries, he often passes by an old abandoned house on the right side of the road. He's aware that the house has been derelict for years and is in rough shape. This time Ian noticed, as he drove past, that there was a car and a caravan in the driveway on the right of the property. Also immediately apparent were brand new white-frame double-glazed windows at the front of the house. He even recalls a hanging basket with fresh flowers growing close to the front door. He thought nothing of it at the time, other than that someone must have bought the place and was living in the caravan and doing up the house. He later mentioned to his wife about the newly renovated house, and a few weeks on they were driving down to Dumfries, with both looking out to see how the house was progressing. Ian was astonished to find that it wasn't. In fact, there was no car or caravan, no new windows, and no hanging basket. The house looked exactly as it had always been, a derelict property. He was absolutely dumbfounded and wondered if he had been mistaken. However, he has a very clear recollection of driving past the house and doing a double take, so is satisfied that what he saw was quite correct, but a very strange phenomenon. Jerry fixes heating and air conditioning for a living. He was on a service call about 10 years ago on a blacktop country road off 145 off exit 66 near Union, Tennessee. He came to a fork in the road where sat what looked like a deserted country store. At one time there had obviously been gas pumps there, but they had been removed. However, what remained was an old orange and white Gulf sign in pristine condition. He knew somebody who refurbished old signs and sold them for good money, and also that they were quite hard to find. So on his way back from the service call, he stopped to take a closer look at the sign. On inspection of the pole that the Gulf sign was attached to, he saw that it was in almost perfect condition. In fact, looked like it had been painted the day before, with not a scratch or nick on it. He also noted that the door to the old store was partially open. It had a large glass window pane in the front, and from the outside looked dark inside. Out of curiosity, he pulled the door back and walked in, only to find the store lit up inside. There was an old man sitting at a counter behind a cash register that looked like it was from the 1890s. The store had wooden shelves stocked with old, outdated merchandise, appearing like an old shop from the 1920s. Jerry walked in rather self-consciously and went over to an old freezer where he slid the top back and retrieved an ice cream sandwich. The old man at the checkout counter never looked at him, but continued to stare out of the window the whole time he was in the store, which was probably only a few minutes. Jerry walked to the wooden counter and laid the ice cream sandwich down, and the man rang up 35 cents. Jerry asked him how long he had worked there, and remembered his only answer was that his father had owned the store in the 1950s. When Jerry walked out and got back in his van, he looked back through the window, and again from the outside it looked dark inside. There were no cars parked around the building, and the sides and back of the store were overgrown and hadn't been mowed in a long time. Not so unusual, and the only thing about the store that looked new was the Gulf sign. About a year later, Jerry passed the same store, stopped and again looked inside. Its state of dilapidation looked like it hadn't been occupied in decades. It took him a while to comprehend what had happened, and to this day he believes he had walked through some kind of shift in time. The alternative is that the elderly man who had worked in the store for so long just decided to come in every day and sit there in a building that looked totally deserted from the outside. But the only thing that makes sense to him is that he somehow walked through time. Anne and her boyfriend have 2 children, and he took the younger child to the store while she stayed home with their older daughter. She played with her for a while and then decided to go upstairs to clean the bathroom. After some time, Anne looked out of the window upstairs down at their driveway and saw their car there with the trunk open and her boyfriend. She registered that he was home early and then yelled at their daughter that Daddy was home. She and the girl went downstairs to the garage because her boyfriend always opens it to bring in the groceries, but no one was there. Anne then ran to the front window and looked out, but their driveway was empty. She quickly went on Facebook and saw that he had sent a photo of their son in the supermarket just some minutes before. She messaged him to ask if he had been home because she had seen him there, but he hadn't. Anne says that he is not someone to lie about an incident like that, or if he did, to never reveal it was a joke. The strange evidence was that he had sent a pic of their son at the store some minutes ago, and it takes much longer to drive to that store. Kiz. In 1994, Kiz drove across Spain. She remembers driving past 4 houses in the interior of the countryside, where 2 were on the left and 2 on the right. She remembers how the houses were arranged, with the 2 on the left in line with each other, and of the 2 on the right, one was opposite the first house on the left, and the house next to it was at a slight angle. All 4 houses had flowers cascading from window boxes and looked spectacular. On her route back 2 weeks later, Kiz looked out for the lovely houses. All 4 houses were derelict, with the window shutters hanging off their fittings. Another bizarre aspect of this experience was that when this all happened, she was driving on the left-hand side of the road, whereas now everyone drives on the right in Spain. But when she later looked it up, she found that until 1924, some parts of Spain, including Madrid, would drive on the left, and when you came to certain towns and villages, you would be instructed to change what side of the road you should be on. She still can't get her head around her strange time glitch experience in the Spanish countryside. Fran. About 25 years ago, Fran and her 3-year-old daughter travelled to Oregon to live closer to her elderly mother. They found an apartment where it was easy to get to know neighbours, one of whom was an elderly man called George, who owned a border collie. George was an amputee with 1 leg and had a fenced-in yard so he could let out his dog and sometimes sit outside enjoying pleasant weather. Fran introduced herself, they became friends, and she would visit him almost daily when she got home from work. George often talked about his life and previous job driving cars for companies and private owners across the country. At one stage, George hurt his leg and went to his physician to get the deep wound taken care of. One day he called Fran and asked her to come over and do wound care for his leg, which she was happy to do as she worked in the medical field and knew how to properly do sterile wound care. On another occasion, she got a call from George asking if she could call him before she left for work in the morning to wake him up for a doctor appointment. The next morning when she called him, he was already up, and Fran told him she would talk to him later when she got home from work. At about 6 p.m, when she arrived home after picking up her daughter from daycare, she called George to see how his doctor visit went, but there was no answer. No lights were on in his house, and a quick check inside found no one home but the dog, who she let out to relieve itself. Fran found some phone numbers by George's telephone and called his son, who later rang back and explained that George had suffered a serious stroke at the doctor's office and was in the hospital. When Fran later visited him there, she was able to only say goodbye. George had been almost like a second father to her, sharing wonderful conversations over the years as she continued to do his wound care. After the passing of her mother, Fran decided to move east to be with other family. Leaving Oregon, she and her daughter headed for New York following their moving van. On the second day of the trip, Fran caught a cold and decided to stop and find a motel just off from the highway. She and her daughter checked into a motel room where she was able to take a small nap. That evening, she went outside to retrieve some things from her car. There was a man in the next motel room who came outside and said hello to her. Shocked, Fran did a double take. He looked exactly like George, but 50 or 60 years younger. They started to chat, and she noticed that he had the same widow's peak hairline George had. His hair was fuller and dark blonde, while George's hair had thinned and was grey. This man had shorts on, and to her astonishment, when she glanced at his left leg, there was a scar in the same place, the same size, on the same leg as George's wound. The coincidences were uncanny, as she still ponders, was this George as he was when he was younger? Did she enter some kind of time and place glitch, or was George visiting her from his time back then? Whatever the explanation, she would never forget this unique encounter. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Frontier Encounter. Rebecca, Becky for short, related a strange experience which happened to her and her brother as children in 2007. At the time, she was 12 years old, and her older brother Jeremy was aged 13 years. While interested in history, but a paranormal skeptic, she reflects that what happened to her and her brother made her a believer in time travel and that there may be an extra dimension out there. She relates that it was a hot summer's day in the American state of South Dakota when she and Jeremy were playing around in their spacious backyard, which she says included a lot of wildlife like prairie dogs, coyote and bison. Jeremy was bigger and taller than Becky, and so she remembers jumping onto a large barrel to tower over him. But just as she climbed onto the barrel and was feeling triumphant and starting to laugh, it suddenly started to rain. She and Jeremy then heard and saw a lightning bolt accompanied by a loud noise that made them both jump. As soon as this happened, the whole landscape changed around them. They were still self-evidently in the state of South Dakota, but it now seemed like they were in an old mining western town that you would see in John Wayne or Clint Eastwood cowboy movies. Becky and her brother could see many horses tied to hitching posts at a general store, hardware stores, saloons and hotels with no cars at all in sight. She could see two young boys on big white horses in the distance, but still no cars. Her recall tells her that if this was a movie set, you would see some cars in the background, but there were none. She now guesses that she and her brother Jeremy were in 1800s South Dakota, at least well before 1910. As luck would have it, she saw posted on a thick tree a travelling circus sign. It said, "The circus is coming to Deadwood, South Dakota on August 10th, 1873. She says that she and her brother were lucky to see this circus sign because it indicated to them both the location and the year they were in. She and Jeremy then looked around and realised that they were suddenly in the midst of a very large crowd of men and women hooting and hollering. Becky could actually smell the horse manure, cigar smoke and whiskey and observed that it was a circus-like atmosphere on a hot August day in Deadwood, South Dakota. She looked down at herself and noticed that her blonde hair was still long, but it had a big pink bow tied at the back. She was wearing a pink dress and was barefoot. Still standing on the big barrel, she looked down at her brother Jeremy, who was now wearing a brown newsboy cap on his head, a brown suit and short pants. He too was barefoot like herself. Their clothing had strangely turned into 1800s outfits. In all the commotion, they both looked straight ahead to realise that there was a hanging in progress at the town square. She did not get the name of the condemned man, but he was to be hanged for a list of crimes which were read out and included homicide, rape, robbery and horse stealing. She extrapolates that the prisoner may have even been caught by the famous lawman at the time, Seth Bullock, who was a Rough Rider and friend of Teddy Roosevelt, who was not yet president at this time. Becky observed the prisoner's face and describes him as a good-looking man in his 30s with a handlebar moustache and wearing a brown three-piece suit. The hangman was an elderly, thin gentleman wearing a black top hat and black three-piece suit. The executioner asked the prisoner if he wanted to say anything before he was hanged, and the prisoner replied simply, "No." The hangman placed a rope around the prisoner's neck and a big black hood over his face. He then pulled a lever when the trapdoor opened and the prisoner fell through. Becky and Jeremy were watching the man writhe like a fish out of water when she suddenly felt someone gently touch her hand. She looked around in surprise to see an enormous heavy-set man with a walrus moustache wearing a derby hat and suit that looked too small for him. The large man asked Becky and her brother to leave this public hanging, saying that it was no place for kids. Becky nodded her head to him as he started to help her off the barrel. But, she says, while he was in the process of doing this, she saw a lightning bolt streak across the sky, and before she and Jeremy noticed, they were back in the present day again. The two children looked around and at each other, shaking their heads and not believing what they had actually seen. They then went home and told their parents their story. Their parents did not believe them, and neither did their friends, save for a soul friend of Becky's called Charlotte, who always trusted her. Another strange aspect of this event was that she and Jeremy were gone for about an hour. However, to their parents, they had only been gone for about 2 minutes. She and her brother still cannot explain this slip in time, but it has made her more accepting of the paranormal. She's gratified that at least Jeremy also witnessed the experience of Deadwood, South Dakota in the 1800s, not just her. Real life reminisce. Marcus relates that his brother Ed loves antiques and collects curios from old cars, motorcycles, carnival rides, as well as tools from the late 1800s to early 1900s. While coming back from a trip to Dallas, where he had gone to check out an old car, he came upon a small store just off Interstate Highway 35 and decided to stop in as it had an old-fashioned appearance. For instance, it had a clapboard porch with rocking chairs, some barrels with items that were on sale, and an old screen door which slapped shut as he entered through it. Ed found the store to be stocked full of antiques and couldn't believe his eyes as the prices were very low. He observed an elderly man tending the counter and watched him meticulously wrap merchandise in brown paper, then used twine to finish wrapping the parcels. The man acknowledged Ed but stayed busy organising shelves. The entire store had wooden floors, and there was a middle-aged woman sweeping the floors with a wooden broom that appeared very old-fashioned, and yet the broom looked like it was new. Ed didn't notice any other customers, while the two shopkeepers went about their business and paid no particular attention to him as he navigated the aisles of shelves fully stocked with goods. Behind the old man there appeared to be an antique calendar with a picture of a blonde girl with rosy cheeks. Ed tried to make out the date but couldn't get a clear view as other items were pinned on the wall. He could make out a 195 but could not see the last number. As he continued walking towards the back part of the store, he began to notice a haze that appeared to glow like amber. The orange glowing haze seemed to surround him, and instantly he felt panic. A thought entered his head that appeared to be warning him not to go any further into the store, or he may never go back to his own time. He immediately turned around and steadily went back to the front part of the store, took one last look and left. As he was leaving, the haze seemed to disappear. He got back into his vehicle and went home, but has since travelled up and down this corridor of IH35, and to this date has never found this antique store again. He believes that he experienced a time slip when he travelled back to maybe the mid-1950s. He feels the merchandise was from the 20s, 30s and 40s, which in the 50s would not be antiques, just dated for that period. Marcus's brother Ed seems to have a propensity for time slips. He told Marcus that one day he planned to return to an old apartment building where they used to live in 1966, as he was missing those good old days and wanted to see what the neighbourhood looks like and to reminisce. As this would involve a 2.5-hour drive, and with the high price of gas, Marcus didn't believe he would bother, but months later in 2012 they caught up and Ed seemed to be in a very good mood. He told Marcus that he had finally gone to where they used to live and seemed surprised as the place looked the same. He had even run into some school friends who were glad to see him again after all these years. However, something strange happened as he walked the block to where the apartment building was located on the corner. As he reached the corner, he was bumped into by a young man rushing to get into the building. As Ed turned to see this young man, he was staring at the spitting image of their father as a young man in his 20s. Ed slowly started to say, "Dad," but the young man, of course, did not recognise Ed, being in his late 50s and with grey hair and beard. Ed stood there in awe for a moment, then thought, "No, I'm just seeing things," and soon returned home. A few weeks went by, and Marcus relayed the story that his brother had shared with him with another relative who had also lived in the apartment block in 1966. He said that it was impossible that Ed had seen that building, much less the neighbourhood. He said that in 2004, the city had commissioned for that whole neighbourhood to be razed to the ground and make room for a much more modern development, with new homes to be built there. Marcus was surprised to hear him say this. Within a few weeks, another relative had passed away, and he needed to travel through this very neighbourhood where they had lived in 1966. He was finally shocked to see that nothing that Ed had seen was there. Their old apartment building was gone, and the road was even closed, as a whole new neighbourhood had been built, with new roads and new homes. He later told his brother that he believed what he had experienced was a time slip, and that he had encountered their father in 1966 when their dad would have been in his 20s. This really shook up Ed, who now also believes that he did experience a time slip.